In northwestern Turkey, on a hill called Hissarlik, stand the remains of the city of Troy, the famed site of a legendary conflict.
Having excavated at Troy for 25 years, many ask me how I understand the Trojan War. Did it occur? How did it occur?
These are questions that have haunted generations of archaeologists. In fact, the history of Troy spans more than 3,500 years. 9 times destroyed and 9 times rebuilt, it remained one of the most prosperous cities in the whole region.
Nowhere else would you find such a majestic city gate. It just shows the wealth and power of the kings and the ruling classes of Troy.
And deep in the city, hidden by its impressive fortifications, archaeologists have discovered fabulous treasures.
The fortification walls were stronger fortifications than you see anywhere else in Western Asia Minor.
For 1,000 years, the Greeks and the Romans made of these ruins a memorial to the glory of the heroes of the Trojan War.
They made the whole region into antiquity's version of Disneyland.
This is the true story of the most mythical of all ancient cities. In the 8th century BC, the poet Homer declaimed for the first time his grand epic, the Iliad, a poem of 15,000 verses that recount the final 3 weeks of the Trojan War.
The Iliad is in a way a sacred text, the Bible of ancient Greek civilization.
At the time, every well-educated person knew the Iliad and all its stories.
One story is said to have taken place in the 13th century BC on the Greek peninsula called the Peloponnese. It tells how the Trojan prince Paris kidnapped Helen, the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. Enraged, the king summoned his allies throughout Greece and set sail with them to Troy to demand the return of his wife. But Paris refused, and that provoked a siege that lasted 10 years and ended in the fall of the city.
This is why Troy is so fundamental to the Iliad. It's the city where all the events narrated in it took place.
But as Homer's epic traveled across the ages, the city gradually fell into oblivion and became, just like the Trojan War itself, a myth.
In 18th and 19th century Europe, historians didn't believe Homer's epics were genuine. And it's unlikely that any self-respecting historian would have come here to research them.
But at the end of the 19th century, one man vowed to find the ruins of the Trojan city. His name was Heinrich Schliemann.
Schliemann was one of the wealthiest person in the world, an Elon Musk of his time.
As he hit middle age, though, he became increasingly interested in other issues. Until one day, a trip to Greece inspired him to look for the origins of all those stories in the Iliad and the Odyssey.
And with the money he made, he set off for northwestern Asia Minor, at that point the Ottoman Empire, intending to prove that Homer's story of a war between Greeks and Trojans was not a myth, but rather a fact, and that it had taken place in northwestern Asia Minor.
Schliemann was convinced that in the Iliad he would find the original site of Homer's Troy. One place in particular caught his interest: Hissarlik.
If you look at the description of Troy in the Iliad, it conforms very closely to the geographical situation around the mound of Hissarlik. The islands are the same, the mountains are the same, the plains are the same.
There was no longer any doubt that Hissarlik was the ancient city described by Homer. Schliemann, however, wanted to prove that the Trojan War did indeed take place. So he launched a first excavation campaign in 1871 and had a gigantic trench dug across the hill, 230 feet wide and over 650 feet long. And what he discovered was extraordinary. He was not unearthing one city, but 9 of them.
Just behind us, we can see the different layers that correspond to the different cities of Troy. The overlapping layers here are not as regular as slices of cake. They look more like an intricate arrangement of different materials and different constructions.
Archaeologists numbered the cities from 1 to 9. Each was built on the ruins of the previous one.
So this is a 50-foot-high artificial hill that was formed between 3000 BC and 500 AD, as we can see here.
3,500 years of history over which hangs the shadow of the greatest myth of ancient days. A myth so powerful that it would lead Schliemann and generations of researchers into a gigantic archaeological investigation that would last for more than a century and would not be an easy task. Troy was a huge puzzle whose pieces would all have to be assembled. To the north of Hissarlik Hill, these windswept stones are older than the pyramids of Egypt. These are the remains of the first city of Troy, founded in 3000 BC.
Due to a rise in sea level, the inhabitants of the area moved to higher ground and founded a new colony on this plateau. It was a community of a few hundred people who made their living mainly from fishing and, to some extent, from farming.
So, back then, was Troy just a village? The remains of these houses seem to indicate the opposite. Built on stone foundations, they consisted of mud brick walls and a roof terrace. Nothing exceptional for the time, apart from one detail.
All we know is that these houses were relatively large, much larger than the norm in the early Bronze Age. They may have been community houses, or they may have been meeting rooms.
There were also some of the most sophisticated construction techniques of the time being used.
The walls were mounted directly on the bedrock, using a V-shaped technique. Look how the stones have been arranged diagonally on top of each other. And what's more, they're raw. They haven't been cut. This is what makes them so solid, so robust.
But what strikes archaeologists the most is the imposing fortification wall that must have surrounded and protected the settlement.
This means that the society in Troy already contained various social differentiations. Because in fact, building such an imposing perimeter wall isn't something that a simple family clan would do by itself, but rather a community whose leader could order such building to be done.
It might possibly have been a small state or a little kingdom from the early days of the city, and this set Troy apart from other colonies in the region.
In 2500 BC, Troy was destroyed. What happened? No one knows. But one thing's for sure, whatever it was, the Trojans never deserted their city.
The people of Troy, that is, the ones who had lived here before, filled in and leveled the city of Troy I to erect a new great fortress, the city of Troy II.
The second city of Troy was now over 320 feet in diameter, a quarter larger than the first. The big houses gave way to 5 huge rectangular buildings called megarons.
These were the largest and most luxurious buildings of their time.
Of all the megarons in Troy, only these remains have come down to us. Discovered in the early 2000s, the construction of this building dates back to 2300 BC.
The megaron is a rectangular building with an entrance and a large main hall. This type of architectural plan later evolved in Anatolia to become the basis of the Greek temple. In other words, all Greek temples were developed from the megaron model.
What was the function of these imposing buildings, the largest of which was 115 feet long and 33 feet wide, and had a hearth 13 feet in diameter?
So it would have held a large group of aristocrats around a central hearth where there would have been feasting, conceivably feasting connected to the gods. There clearly was a king and an aristocracy, and then lower classes, and the citadel was organized accordingly. So Troy was saying, by virtue of the size of the megaron and the strength of the citadel walls, that they were a major player on the political stage.
Troy was the leading power from the Sea of Marmara to the north, from the island of Lesbos to the south, and to Mount Ida in the east. So, to seal their reputation, the Trojans built 2 huge ramps that served as entrances to the citadel. The largest was almost 70 feet long and 25 feet wide.
The second Troy had several entrances. Here, we're on the large ramp that leads to the main entrance to the city. You could search the whole Mediterranean at that time, and nowhere would you find such a majestic entrance. What makes this entrance so special is its width, its access to the citadel, and the sheer amount of stones used. This type of entrance was an important symbol, a true show of strength that testified to both the wealth and the power of the city's rulers.
But the most impressive thing about it was the size of the defensive system, as evidenced by the thick wall that still surrounds the citadel.
The fortifications for Troy too, about 2500, 2400 BC, were even stronger, about 5 meters high and up to 4 meters in thickness. These are incredibly strong for the early Bronze Age, for 2400 BC, for fortifications.
And that's not all. In the 1980s, about 200 yards from the citadel, archaeologist Manfred Korfmann made an incredible discovery. Thanks to magnetic resonance radar, a new technology for the time that can gather information under the ground, he unearthed some curious footprints.
There are cavities cut into the bedrock with gaps in them, into which wooden posts have been driven to create a kind of protective wall.
A 10-foot thick palisade made of wooden logs, buttresses, and columns.
So there was a wooden palisade wall around the residential district south of the city, and then there was a stone fortification wall around the most important buildings on the citadel. So a dual line of defense.
Why did the people of Troy design such a sophisticated system of fortifications? What did they want to protect? Schliemann found the answer on the 31st of May, 1873, during his third excavation campaign. On the ramparts, not far from this fig tree, he made a discovery so exceptional that he kept it absolutely secret.
According to his account, when he realized that there were going to be important discoveries made on May the 31st, he told his workers that that day was his birthday, so they needn't come to work, but would be paid anyway. And then he adds, "Despite the danger that lurked, my wife Sophia and I continued to search and hid our findings under her skirt. Then we transported them to our cabin."
What he unearthed was an incredible treasure trove of 10,000 precious objects. Bracelets, crowns, necklaces, finely chased gold, including this extraordinary golden headdress that he had his wife wear.
We know for sure that on June the 6th, 1873, the treasure was all smuggled to Greece on board a ship that had been skulking in a nearby port.
Why did Schliemann steal this treasure?
It was a phenomenal treasure, and that he thought must relate to the citadel of Priam, legendary king of Troy, and to the Trojan War itself.
The businessman was convinced that he'd found proof of the existence of the Trojan War, and that this discovery would make him a legend. And yet...
Now, those treasures do not prove that this was the city of the Trojan War in 2400. It's about 1,000 years too early for a time when there would have been armed conflict between Greeks and Anatolians, the people living in modern-day Turkey.
Schliemann got it wrong. It wasn't Priam's treasure, but its discovery sheds valuable light on the city at the end of the second millennium BC. Analyses have shown that the jewels are not native to the region. So where did they come from? The key to this mystery lies in this tiny, seemingly banal object, many examples of which have been found throughout the city.
This is one of the oldest and most important objects found in Troy. Schielman just couldn't figure out what it was. In fact, it was simply a weight from a loom, and we're quite sure that purple textiles, which were the rarest and most expensive, were among the fabrics that were being made. When it came to trade, this made Troy very powerful. These textiles could be sold or traded for precious jewels from Afghanistan, for example.
So we have amber in those treasures from the Baltic, we have lapis lazuli from northeastern Afghanistan, we have carnelian from the Indus Valley in Pakistan. So there was a very complex trade network of which Troy formed a part. It clearly was a sophisticated society, and its wealth was on display.
But then, in 2300 BC, life came to a stop, and the city was emptied of all its inhabitants. What had happened? Valuable clues were found in the Megaron. The reddish color of its bricks betrays exposure to very high heat, and the structure of its walls contains a lot of debris.
If we look closely at this wall, it appears that this Megaron was destroyed by an earthquake, followed by a fire. Close examination shows that the ceramic vessels that were inside were broken and compressed. There's also a very thick burnt layer. So the Megarons of Troy II were in fact destroyed by a major fire.
After its destruction, Troy sank into a long lethargy. As for Schliemann, in spite of all his research, he never found proof of the existence of the Trojan War. But others long before him had also set off in quest of the same myth. Men determined to make Troy a monument to the heroes of the Iliad. In the 8th century BC, a group of Greek settlers set off from the island of Lesbos, heading for Troy. They settled on the slopes of the hill of Hissarlik, where the remains of the city lay, and they named it Ilion, Troy in ancient Greek.
The focus of life was a temple of Athena, which no longer survives, but which allegedly had a treasury within it with relics stemming from the time of the Trojan War. The people who would have lived in Ilion would have been those who were connected to the temple of Athena and possibly some farmers, but it was a fairly small settlement.
Their goal was not to rebuild the city, but to establish a sanctuary there. It is here, to the southwest of the citadel, that archaeologists have found traces of it. Like these two altars built on top of each other.
These altars we see here are perhaps the earliest and oldest structures in Iliad. They're evidence that there was a vast sacred space in this area. There might have been animal sacrifices here, but it could also have been a place to bring daily household products to put on the altars as offerings.
Which deities were these ceremonies intended for? It's impossible to say. But one thing is certain. The location of the altars at the foot of the ancient walls owes nothing to chance.
They were convinced that this was the place where the Trojan War had taken place. And in that belief, they built a shrine in front of the western entrance. The ruins thus actually served a memorial function after the 8th century, as a kind of stage setting for memories of the Trojan War.
The ramparts became the object of a veritable cult, as did a series of burial mounds scattered all around the city. These were said to house the sepulchres of the heroes of the Iliad. Like here, 5 miles away from Hissarlik, where, according to legend, the ashes of the mighty Achilles were buried.
So it was a kind of, I always refer to it as a kind of turning the site into a Homeric Disneyland, where people could come and see where Hector was buried, where Priam was buried, where Hecuba was buried. Now, these are old settlement mounds of Neolithic date. They have nothing to do with the Trojan War, but your re-identification, your Homerization of the landscape doesn't have to be true, it just has to be marketed well. And they had very good public relations people at Troy presenting this as the place where the Trojan War occurred.
The city became a place of pilgrimage, attracting such illustrious visitors as the Persian king Xerxes in 480 BC, or Alexander the Great, a century and a half later, who at just 21 years old led his armies to subdue the Persian Empire. As soon as he landed in Anatolia, he made his first stop in Ilion.
The truth is that when Alexander the Great arrived in Troy and first saw the city, he was disappointed. It was called Ilion back then, and it was in a pretty disastrous state. Sources from the time say that there weren't even any tiles on the roofs of the houses.
Alexander, raised from an early age in the cult of the Iliad, went to the Temple of Athena, where he received the gifts of relics that were said to have belonged to the Trojan warriors.
Troy was the place where Alexander became Alexander the Great. He fully identified with the Homeric epics, with the Trojan War and its heroes. He would never cease to exploit the myth of the Iliad in order to serve his own military and political objectives.
In his gratitude, Alexander swore an oath.
He promised to restore the site or to build up the site to a state that was appropriate for its legendary significance.
The Temple of Athena was completely rebuilt. To accommodate it, a vast terrace 357 feet long by 288 feet wide had to be built. Lined with porticos, it offered breathtaking views of the Dardanelles and the plains of Troy.
The archaeological excavations have shown that the temple was built here after the ancient structures of the late Bronze Age had been cleared. This space thus formed a large esplanade with the entrance to the temple to the south.
The new building measured 52 feet by 115 and had 32 columns. At the time, it was the largest Doric temple in northwestern Asia Minor.
That was a phenomenally dazzling temple with sculpture on all 4 sides of the temple, and the subjects they chose were the same as those that had been used for the Parthenon in Athens.
It was destroyed during the Byzantine period, and only a few traces remain today. Some marble columns and a few pieces of carved ceilings that still testify to its splendor.
And so this was a temple as magnificent as the legendary traditions that now surrounded the site. So visitors would come not just to see the place where the Trojan War had occurred, but also this dazzling temple.
A temple just as strange as it was dazzling. This well, for instance, is a most unusual feature in this type of sanctuary. Once overlooked by a small building that has now disappeared, it is still accessible at the end of this passage.
During the excavations, it was discovered that this passage was originally covered. You see, this part here was covered, and the whole thing was actually enclosed.
Why was this shaft only accessible through an underground passage? The explanation lies in one of the strangest traditions of Troy: the Locrian maids. According to Homer, during the sack of the city, Cassandra, daughter of King Priam, was raped by Ajax in the temple of Athena. To atone for this dreadful act, the inhabitants of Locri, the birthplace of Ajax, were condemned to send 2 virgin maidens to Troy every year to serve the goddess Athena.
The tradition of the Locrian maidens was that the eyes of the cult statue of Athena could never fall on the maidens themselves as they cleaned Athena's sanctuary.
According to the myth, Locrian maidens could even be killed if they were seen entering the temple.
So during the day, you would see the Locrian maidens going into the underground chamber to draw water from the well, and the tour guides would then say to the visitors, you see these women going into the underground chamber. They can't draw water from the well at ground level because of the sins of their ancestor. Again, all of this is wrapped up in the Homeric tourism industry.
Rarely has a city been so shaped by its own myth. But was it actually the scene of the Trojan War? To try to find out, we have to go back a millennium earlier, when the region was the scene of the confrontation of 2 superpowers. The 13th century BC. Troy is at the height of its power. The citadel now covers almost a square mile, double its original size. You entered it through this wide entrance that led to the main street. Even today, you can still go in that way.
Here we are at the southern entrance to Troy 6, which dates back to the Bronze Age. During its construction, the Trojans set up a system of canals in the middle of the causeway in order to channel rainwater and sewage. So this is a system that had been very, very well planned.
With its sewers and cobbled streets, Troy was one of the most sophisticated cities of its day.
The architectural features clearly show that the city of Troy was actually a very wealthy and well-organized trading center, with, in the Bronze Age, a population of around 6,000 people. This street here that runs through the southern entrance actually leads to many palaces.
The palace's impressive foundation wall, made of large cut stone blocks, is still standing.
Looking at the architecture of this structure, we can deduce that it was probably a 2 or even 3-story palace.
On the upper floors, the walls of this impressive building were made of mud bricks covered with stucco.
Another important aspect of this palace is that it faces the west entrance. It's right in front of us. So, when you stand at the top of the palace, you can see the western entrance, but also the entire plain of Troy.
Could Priam have seen Agamemnon's armies approaching from this palace? We'll never know. One thing's certain, though. The sheer size of this building is the mark of a very powerful elite.
Back then, Troy 6 was probably the capital of the largest kingdom in northwestern Anatolia.
A kingdom caught between 2 superpowers. The Achaeans, originally from Greece,
a people who seem to have exercised some dominance and had bases in the Aegean Sea and in western Anatolia,
and the Hittites of central Anatolia.
The Hittite Empire dominated the eastern part of Anatolia, but it also controlled several vassal kingdoms in western Anatolia.
What place did Troy occupy on this political chessboard? The answer lies in this Hittite tablet in cuneiform script, dated 1280 BC and discovered in central Anatolia.
This is a treaty that states that the king of Wilusa, meaning Troy in Hittite, was a vassal of the great king of the Hittite Empire. This means that Troy was thus exposed to attacks from the Achaeans in the west. And therefore, this might well have led to a large expedition, a very large expedition, just like the one described in the famous Iliad, where the Achaean fleet landed near Troy with the aim of conquering the city.
To counter such a threat, the Trojans built impressive fortifications, consisting of a freestone wall, flanked by towers and bastions. Entire sections of these 3,000-year-old constructions have come down to us almost intact. How could the Trojans have accomplished such a feat?
The wall is sloping, and it stands on the bedrock. But between the two, we discovered a layer of sand that seems to have been put there to absorb the impact of earthquakes. So the engineers of the time actually took steps to make the city's walls and defenses earthquake-proof. In Bronze Age architecture in Anatolia, there is no other example that demonstrates such well-thought-out construction engineering.
Does this wall conform to Homer's account? He doesn't give a precise description of it, but he does say it had been able to hold back any assault by the Greeks for nearly 10 years.
We estimate that this stone wall here was probably between 16 and 20 feet high and was crowned by a structure of bricks. Anyone approaching from the outside would have been faced with a tower and a wall of considerable height.
But were these fortifications exceptional for the time?
The fortification walls around the citadel were phenomenally strong fortifications, reaching a height of over 10 meters and 5 meters thick. Stronger fortifications than you see anywhere else in Western Asia Minor.
This proves that from an architectural point of view, the city walls were incredibly well built, majestic and flamboyant, as described by Homer in the Iliad.
Just over 400 yards south of the citadel, in the 1980s, Manfred Kaufmann's teams made an incredible discovery. They unearthed the remains of a moat 14 feet wide and about 7 feet deep that surrounded the lower town.
This defensive ditch was apparently designed to stop war chariots getting through. And just behind it, even though we haven't found any hard evidence, there might well have been a wooden palisade, similar to the one we found at Troy too.
This combination of ditch and palisade would be covered over with thorny bushes. This was a very effective defense system that proves that Troy VI was a city that really needed good security.
So if you wanted to sack the city, you would have had to have gotten into and out of the ditch, presumably avoiding the arrows that were being fired at you by the Trojan archers from the wall on the interior side of the ditch. Then you had to run 400 meters. You would reach the stone citadel wall. You had to get over a wall that was 10 meters high, and then you could sack what you wanted.
This incredible system of defenses would have enabled the city to have held off the assaults of a powerful army. But surviving a siege required two conditions: having a sufficient supply of food and having access to a source of clean water. Did Troy have such resources? In the 2000s, Manfred Kaufmann's team cleared the entrance to a tunnel. It concealed a network of several hundred yards of galleries dug into the rock and connected to a water source.
It's a spring that's been channeled in a similar way to what's done in Iran, for example, where water is captured and then transported underground to villages. We have something similar in Troy, and this system of tunnels seems to have been accessible from the citadel, although it hasn't been proven yet.
The tunnels were then connected to tanks. One of them has been unearthed to the southeast of the citadel. Archaeologists have excavated it to a depth of over 20 feet, and they still haven't reached the bottom.
And here we are at one of the most crucial points of the Trojan 6 hydraulic system. It's a cistern that's been dug into the rock. Thus, during the summer, it was fed by water filtered through the geological layer, and in winter by rain. So, by going to this cistern, people could obtain water both from inside the citadel and outside.
So, Troy could count on large reserves of water. But what about food? In the ancient lower town, archaeologists have unearthed a building that has provided them with valuable clues.
We're entering the so-called terrace house. It's actually a large building built under the western entrance to the castle. One of the most important structures in the lower city of Troy, just outside the citadel.
This building was made of mud bricks covered with lime, and on top of it was a large terrace. Its dimensions would suggest a communal building. Inside, archaeologists discovered 13 pithi, huge jars that, buried in the ground, served as a pantry.
These pithos were used to store both grain and liquids. We know that all of them were covered with this type of lid. Towards the end of the Bronze Age, there was a considerable increase in the number of these pithos, which suggests that the Trojans were preparing for a possible attack.
It's hard to say just how many of these jars Troy had, because to date, only 3% of the lower town has been excavated. One thing is certain: the hoarding of reserves like these means there was a radical change in the balance of power in the region.
They had an enormous supply of food in the event that they didn't have the luxury of being able to leave the protection of the city wall. So they would have been able to survive a siege far better in the 13th century than they could have, for example, in the 14th.
With its solid fortifications and large reserves of food and water, Troy had all the makings of an impregnable city. Yet, according to Homer, it eventually fell. How could the Greeks have accomplished such a feat?
Here you have a toy that is thousands of years old. A horse, actually. Now, if we delve into the Iliad, we learn that the Trojans were not only excellent breeders of horses, but also had an immense love for them. The Greeks were very aware of this and came up with a ruse to end the war, one that involved a horse.
This ruse is said to have been thought up by Odysseus, king of Ithaca.
The key to the sack was a monumental wooden horse that the Greeks had crafted with a hollow stomach, into which the Greek soldiers hid.
The Greeks were convinced that the Trojans couldn't refuse this gift in the form of a horse, and they were absolutely right.
The Trojans, believing it to be an offering, duly carried the horse into the citadel.
And then the Greek soldiers in the horse crept out by night and sacked the city.
So is this most famous episode of the Trojan War at all believable?
No. At the time in which the Iliad was written down, late 8th century, there were a lot of these siege engines, but they weren't in place yet at the end of the Bronze Age, so it's a later addition to the story.
If the Trojan horse is a creature of myth, one thing is for sure: the city underwent a great upheaval at the end of the 13th century BC. The great cistern suddenly ceased to be used, and the city was abandoned. What happened? In 1932, just a few yards from the south gate, archaeologist Carl Blegen discovered some precious clues. 2 skeletons and some arrowheads.
Here, Blegen discovers traces of fire and objects such as arrowheads. For him, these skeletons abandoned in the street without a burial are proof that this was the last phase of the city's destruction.
And a few yards from there, Blegen made another discovery. In this palace, one of the greatest of its time, he unearthed a mixture of ashes and rubble more than a yard thick.
These traces of fire are similar to those found outside in the street, and therefore corroborate Blegen's conclusions. According to him, at the end of the Bronze Age, Troy was hit by a great war, a major attack and a catastrophe. In other words, the Trojan War.
In Homer's version of events, Troy would therefore have been destroyed at the end of the 13th century BC. The reality appears to match the fiction. But is the evidence accumulated by generations of archaeologists enough to prove that this war was indeed the one recounted in the Iliad?
Here, I think we have to look at the clay tablets that have been excavated at the Hittite capital of Hattusha. These tablets show that there was conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites and their allies, one of whom was Troy, over a 200-year period. That over 500 years of oral tradition is condensed into a single war until the Iliad, telling the story of the Trojan War, is finally written down. So there is a kernel of truth in history to the story of the Trojan War, but the answer really lies with these texts that have been fairly recently deciphered in the Hittite capital of Hattusha.
Troy still has many secrets. Who knows what treasures the next generations of archaeologists will discover? But one thing's for sure, just as they have for more than 30 centuries, the shadows of the heroes of the Iliad will still hover over the ruins of Troy.